Welcome to CNN Talk. We are talking Iran-US tensions. They are escalating. They've been escalating, obviously, over a matter of months and years, but in recent days, it's very concerning. We need to confirm exactly what's been happening there.
Well, we talked about this last week, didn't we? President Trump removed waivers on sanctions on the export of Iranian oil. President Rouhani's pleaded about the economic impact of that. But now over the weekend, we've had some really strong words from John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, really quite hawkish. And we've, of course, seen the USS Abraham Lincoln moving into the Gulf with 40 or 50 fighter planes on that aircraft carrier. Lots of rhetoric at the moment, but really, and lots of talk about Iranian forces, if you like, targeting US military interests in the Middle East. But what's really interesting over the weekend is the emergence of some possible split between the more hawkish elements in the Trump administration, Bolton and Pompeo, as I said, and Trump himself. And we saw just yesterday a call by President Trump over Twitter: if the Iranians want to avoid confrontation, call me.
Yeah, we'll have that soundbite. I mean, they are talking about war. I mean, Pompeo said our aim is not war. We've got Jeremy Hunt saying he's concerned about war. The discussion about war is worrying in itself, isn't it?
Well, nobody's going to say they want war. At least I would hope so. I would hope not. I think Liam's absolutely right. I think the most interesting part of the last few days, since we talked about it on the programme on Thursday, is Trump's lack of bellicose language. And it was something that I think we need to concentrate on and go back to basics. Trump, part of his election campaign was, I am not going to get America involved in foreign escapades. We want to bring the troops home. And he's largely stayed loyal to that pledge. And I think it would be, for him, catastrophic with his base to launch a war, if that's what we want to call it, against Iran. So I suspect that John Bolton is the one that's driving all of this bellicose language in Washington. I mean, it doesn't take Einstein to work that one out, I have to admit. And it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next few days as to whether Trump changes his language and sort of sends out some incendiary tweets. But, I mean, I can't see what either side has to gain from taking this to the brink.
Well, that's the question. What's the US strategy here? Why take on Iran now?
Well, I sort of agree with what's been said. I think that you've got three very hawkish advisors around Trump who are really doing the heavy lifting on the Iran stuff. You've got John Bolton, you've got Mike Pence, and you've got Pompeo as well. They are much, much more hawkish about this. I mean, Trump has been really preoccupied with tweeting about Joe Biden and the China trade war. I mean, that's been his kind of main sort of focus. This hasn't been his focus. And I think there has been, those three have really ramped up their kind of old strategic sort of war with Iran. You know, Iran is their number one enemy in that region. And Iran is also the enemy of the great allies of America, the House of Saud, and, of course, Netanyahu in Israel as well. And I think that they are ramping. I don't know really why they're ramping up the rhetoric so much. Again, it could be a bit of a diversion. Maybe they don't want to get to the point where they're actually going to war, but they know that, you know, a bit of muscularity on the world stage does play quite well.
And it did work with North Korea, in a sense, didn't it? Because if you remember, Trump was, it was Trump this time rather than his advisors, but he was really ramping up the language with North Korea.
Little rocket man.
To the extent that I predicted a war.
You did.
Well, welcome to CNN Talk. It's Monday. We're talking about the Iran-US tensions. They've been ramping up in the recent days and over the weekend. How should Donald Trump respond, we're asking you?
The United Arab Emirates is reporting acts of sabotage against 4 commercial boats off its eastern coast.
Saudi Arabian state media report that 2 Saudi oil tankers were attacked.
The US has warned that Iran could be targeting vessels in the area. Iran's president calling on the nation's political factions to come together amid increased pressure from the US.
This comes as the US has increased its military presence in the Middle East.
What I'd like to see with Iran, I'd like to see them call me.
The United States is sending more of its naval forces and Patriot missile batteries.
The biggest risk, in my opinion, is the risk of miscalculation here, because as far as we know, we do not have direct communication with the Iranians.
We're not going to miscalculate. Our aim is not war.
Ahmad says on Facebook, the US is doing this for Israel. Diane says someone has to stop presidential threats on Twitter. It's a dangerous game. And Thomas says President Trump should try to de-escalate the situation. Welcome to our viewers listening on the podcast, on Apple Podcasts, looking up CNN Talk. You can do the same as well. It stays there and you can listen to the discussion. We're going to go to Fred first, though, because Fred's in Tehran. There you are, Fred. There were some events in the Strait of Hormuz, and we haven't seen any evidence exactly what happened. Some tankers were damaged. Tell us what the reporting is on that. What do we know to be true?
Yeah, Max, this is both the Saudis and also the UAE coming out and saying that several tankers that were under their flag had been sabotaged, and what they called acts of sabotage on Sunday. Now, they haven't come out directly and blamed the Iranians for this, but of course, one of the things that the U.S. did, I think it was last Thursday, the U.S. said that they believe that there are, with these tensions going on between the U.S. and the Iranians, that the Iranians could retaliate against merchant ships. Now, the Iranians themselves have actually come out and condemned these acts, and they, in an interestingly worded statement, saying that there could be forces in the Persian Gulf, outside forces that might use this situation to try and escalate things between the factions there. And so the Iranians sort of saying, look, they believe someone else might be behind this. No one really saying that it was the Iranians, but of course it is something that could really inflame tensions in the Persian Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz, which of course is an area, Max, where you really have American military assets and Iranian military assets in very, very close proximity.
Thanks, Fred. He's going to be with us throughout the programme. Iran denying any involvement here. I mean, how do you read the latest movements?
Well, the Straits of Hormuz, of course, are the funnel point into the Persian Gulf. Around a quarter of oil shipped by sea goes through that little pinch point. A lot of people call that the kind of the throat of the world economy, if you like. So it's always been a very massive strategic importance. We have seen a big escalation in tension just in the last 48 and 72 hours since we were discussing Iran on CNN Talk last week. It strikes me that there is a split now in the Trump administration. You've got Trump himself, uncharacteristically, some may say, trying to be less bellicose, trying to be a bit more dovish, but he's got John Bolton in there as National Security Advisor. He's got Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State. Very different from the likes of Mattis and Rex Tillerson. And there is concern, and we can see it on the oil markets now, that there is the possibility now of conflict between the US and Iran.
Let's hear from Mike Pompeo, because he used the war word, which has alarmed a lot of people.
We're not going to miscalculate. Our aim is not war. Our aim is a change in the behavior of the Iranian leadership. We hope the Iranian people will get what they finally want, what they so richly deserve.
Just the fact that he mentioned war, even though he's saying he doesn't want war, is what's worried a lot of people as a result of that. Does it concern you?
Well, he said we don't want war. I mean, what's he going to say? He didn't say we want war. That would be concerning. I'm not concerned by that language at all. I think that Iran has proven itself over the past 40 years to be a very unreliable international partner. And there was a point where we thought that Iran was wanting to come back into the family of nations. And there's obviously internal conflicts in Iran between President Rouhani, who's seen as a moderate, although in these terms moderation is a strange word to use. But he has his views on how things should be conducted. But he's got all the religious leaders above him who really do pull the strings. So if we hear bellicose language from him, sometimes you have to think, well, is he playing to a domestic audience, his political leaders, or is he really trying to issue a threat to the international community? I suspect on occasion it's a little bit of both. It's quite difficult to see where this ends, and that's what Liam is absolutely right here. What is the end game of US policy here? I hope it's not any sort of military conflict, because that really would be a disaster for everybody. I mean, Iran would stand to lose out worse, and they know that. I mean, Iran is not a stupid nation. Rouhani is not a stupid man. He will know that if there is any form of war, Iran is going to be the loser here.
David says Trump needs a war diversion.
From what? From what does he need a diversion?
Don't know.
I mean,
Well,
the economy's going gangbusters. The Mueller inquiry is out of the way now. What does he need a diversion
I don't
from?
think that's right. I think there's quite a lot of truth in what our contributor just said. I mean, often when he does have local difficulties at home, he pivots into, trying to save the world and America being the sort of policeman of the world. I think what their strategy is, I do agree with Liam. I think Trump has not been 100% focused on Iran right now. I think that has been much more driven, this kind of hawkishness has been driven by Bolton, by Pompeo, and by Mike Pence, the vice president as well. And I think what they are really doing is they are really, from a diplomatic and economic point of view, they are really going after Iran. They are trying to goad Iran, and they're trying to test how much support Iran will get from other partners. For example, the EU, they came over to Britain, spoke to Jeremy Hunt, the British Foreign Secretary. Jeremy Hunt has basically sort of said, look, slightly kind of watery words saying, look, we want to try and get everything back on track, but not actually pushing back against the Americans. Now, I hold no candle for the Iranian regime. Their human rights abuse is horrific. The way they treat women, particularly over wearing of the headscarf. Let me just be clear, no candle for that regime whatsoever. But America is absolutely, and Iran's sort of opponents are absolutely unifying to go after them. They are isolating them. We've obviously, they've ripped up the nuclear deal when Iran was not found to have breached the terms of that deal. There have been cyber attacks in Iran. There have been scientists that have been assassinated. And what I think they're trying to do is goad Iran into provocation so that then the might can be put against them. And you are right. And remember that the House of Saud and Netanyahu are absolutely gunning for this as well. It is in all of those three countries' strategic interest to really isolate. And by the way, the EU will not ride to the rescue of Iran. And if you read somebody like, for example, the former Guardian foreign editor, Simon Tisdall, he has actually said, you could reach a situation which is so fragile in Iran that there is real destabilisation because of this, which could prompt regime change. So I think they're trying to test and push Iran to break.
But the goading has worked to an extent, because Rouhani last week, and this is really why we're talking about this now, Rouhani gave the EU 60 days to persuade America to get back on track. Otherwise, they would start re-enriching uranium. Now, the EU, I'm afraid, is not going to be able to do that, whether they want to or not. America is not going to bend. So in 60 days' time, that's when the crunch time will come.
We know, Fred, don't we, that Mike Pompeo is swinging by Brussels. This is a last-minute move in order to work with the EU on the Iran issue. Is Iran speaking to the EU as well? What's the debate there, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you guys are absolutely right. And it's quite interesting to see how both, it seems to us, how both the American side and also the Iranian side is really sort of trying to put pressure on the Europeans. One of the things that the Iranians have said from the beginning is that with the U.S. leaving the nuclear deal, what Iran expects is for Europe to essentially make up the difference of what Iran is losing in commercial activity with the U.S. not being part of that deal. Now, of course, absolutely, the Europeans are not going to be able to do that. They tried or are trying to start an investment vehicle to get around U.S. sanctions. The Iranians obviously not happy with that at all. And I think that ultimatum that you heard from the Iranians there last week was very much aimed at the Europeans, saying you have to get this investment vehicle going. You have to make sure that we can trade oil, that we can sell our oil again, and you have to make sure that some of the financial sanctions go away as well. That is something that it seems very difficult for the Europeans to do, but that's the pressure that the Iranians are exerting right now. And essentially, what the Iranians are saying is, look, there is this nuclear agreement. The U.S. and Iran have decided to hold the Europeans and the Iranians and the Russians and Chinese have decided to hold on to that nuclear agreement. The Iranians are saying they're abiding by it and they want to reap the benefits. And of course, absolutely, they're getting huge pressure here at home because the economic situation is getting worse. And it is true that with that, of course, the hardliners here also are feeling somewhat empowered, especially right now with the standoff going off with the U.S. It's very, very interesting to see because on the one hand, you have people like Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister, who's coming out and sort of trying to go into those discords that you guys were talking about in the Trump administration, saying he thinks that Donald Trump doesn't want war, but that some of his advisors do want war. He's putting pressure on the Europeans. But then you have people from the Revolutionary Guard who are coming out, look, if the Americans want trouble, they can have it. They say their ballistic missiles are ready. They could hit aircraft carriers. They could hit bases. So there's some pretty bellicose talk coming out from the Iranians as well. But a lot of pressure also being exerted on the Europeans from the Iranian government.
Some of that talk on Facebook as well. El Mehdi saying, I want war because it's the only way left with the Ayatollah regime. We have to demolish it.
Yeah, the head of the Revolutionary...
From Saudi Arabia.
The head of the Revolutionary Guard... the Revolutionary Guard was just designated by the US as a terrorist organisation. It's a sort of the administration and, if you like, that surrounds the theocrats mainly who sit above President Rouhani, as Ian said, in the Iranian hierarchy. The head of the Revolutionary Guard said over the weekend, if America strikes, quote, we will hit them on the head. So there's a lot of tension going there. A lot of this goes back to that nuclear deal signed in 2016. It was an Obama-era deal. Trump, of course, unilaterally removed the US from that deal. But on the other side, you do have the EU, you do have the Chinese, you do have the Russians, and Mike Pompeo is going to Moscow after he's been in Brussels. You have the Germans lined up against America. You also have enormous EU business interests in Iran. The likes of Renault, Citroën have massive car factories in Iran. Look, this is a country of 80 million people. Yeah, this should be an investment hotspot of the world. It's got masses of oil and gas, masses of technical education. And after that Iranian nuclear deal, foreign investment did flow in.
In fact, they were talking about opening up tourism.
Big time.
In
Rouhani spoke about Iran being a top 10 world economy by 2030. And that wasn't mad by any means. But with these sanctions on, and they're very, very punitive, it's not just on oil, it's on Iranian entities using the dollar anywhere in the world, and the US can control that through the SWIFT mechanism of the banking system. You've now got Rouhani, you know, Western educated. He is a moderate by Iranian standards. He was the midwife of that nuclear deal. Now he's getting a hard time from the theocrats. You've now got him pleading, saying, look, the economy in Iran is now worse than during the 1980s Iran-Iraq war. Iran's contracting by 6% a year, according to the IMF, and that was before this last wave of sanctions.
We've talked about the Saudi influence here. What we haven't talked about is the Israeli influence, because, of course, a lot of people suspect, I'd love to hear what Fred thinks about this, that Israel is in part driving American policy here. Netanyahu, I would say, is probably Trump's closest ally in the whole world in many ways. So how much is Israel driving the American policy here? Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a great supporter of Israel, but I think it's a question that we should ask.
Yeah, Fred, I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, a lot of cynics suggesting this is about the elections coming up as well and the vote that's sympathetic to Israelis in America.
Well, that's certainly something that you heard from Iranian officials, and I think it's one of the interesting things that we've been hearing in the messaging coming out of Tehran over the past couple of weeks. It was really ramped up by the foreign minister Javad Zarif a couple of weeks ago when he coined the term the B team, which he said was influencing American politics, was essentially saying that it was influencing American politics against the will of Donald Trump, if you will. And the B team, of course, is John Bolton, Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, and then also Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So the Iranians clearly pushing that message that they think that U.S. foreign policy is essentially being radio controlled in part by the Israelis and then in part, of course, by the Saudis as well, and of course by hardliners like John Bolton. So that certainly is something that's going around here. But I want to get back to, if I may, because you guys were talking about, you know, Iran during the nuclear deal thinking it was going to become a big economy, that things were all going to get better here. There was certainly time. I witnessed all this. I saw the time running up to the nuclear agreement, right after the nuclear agreement, when companies like Renault and Peugeot came back. The big problem that these companies have right now is that they have a choice to make. They can either do business in Iran or they can do business with the Americans. And if you look at big companies like Siemens, for instance, from Germany, are they going to give up tens of billions of dollars in investment in America to start doing business here in Iran? It's something that's become a really, really big issue for the Iranians. And you could see even some of the investments that already have been made and had been made already disappearing here again. And just to paint a picture for you guys of the economic situation here in Iran, it's getting really dire. The prices are going up. The currency is devaluating. There's a lot of people who simply can't afford things like meat and haven't been able to for weeks and some of them for months. The medical situation is a really big disaster here as well. So this is certainly something that's crunching the economy and that's causing problems for the Rouhani government, for the power structure here as well, but certainly isn't endearing the Trump administration to the Iranian people either.
I mean, I think that is a really, really important point, and there are concerns that actually what you could see is this massive uprising within Iran. Liam is right. There is a, you know, even though it's not a moderate. Well, I'll tell you what would be a bad thing is if the Americans are pushing this country to breaking point and they actually want regime change and, you know,
what's the alternative regime?
And also, let's be honest, what America doesn't have a great track record in is meddling in other countries' affairs, causing regime change and then having any plan to back it up. Now, we've just had the sort of triumphant destruction of ISIS, or have we? And, you know, make no mistake, if there is going to be, you know, huge, huge, huge instability in Iran, no good will come for it. It is not like America will ride to the rescue of the people of Iran. It's not like the EU or the UN or the big guns will put boots on the ground to get stability. Who do you think will come in to that very divided, disparate space? I think we all know the answer to that, and it's not.
We'll discuss it more after the break. How do you think Trump should respond to the tensions currently escalating between the US and Iran?
I was actually in Iran in 2016 and 2017 during that sort of uplift in investment and huge. I mean, Tehran was crawling with Western businessmen and women, you know, makeup companies, wealth management companies, pension providers, because it has such potential. The median age,
a young population
is 28.
As well. Yeah.
It's poised. It's the biggest emerging market in the world that hasn't yet emerged, and it has all this amazing human capital and pent-up potential. And actually, what's interesting to me is that as the economy gets better, Rouhani becomes more popular. So during 2016, 2017, in local elections, he was going gangbusters, to coin your phrase. Really a lot of popularity for him and his sort of modernising movement. And, you know, the theocrats didn't like that. So it's almost as if not just parts of the State Department or John Bolton's office want conflict and aggro. The theocrats want conflict and aggro too, because that keeps them in place. Yeah. That keeps the Iranian population down, inward-looking, anti-Western, and it all comes down to economics. If people can't feed their families, smart, hard-working people can't feed their families, and they think it's because of the way they've been interacting with the West.
And there's that rise, that very hard anti-American
that's when you
feeling.
get revolution
And that's when the theocrats win.
How should Trump respond to tensions between the US and Iran? Pepino says another war to keep him in power to avoid impeachment. That's the solution. You can't impeach a president who's at war, apparently. Simac says Trump should go to the negotiating table with Iran, not send warships to the Persian Gulf. Well, actually, Trump has suggested such a thing. Let's hear from him.
We are very worried about the risk of it.
Risk of military confrontation, sir? I guess you could say that always, right? Isn't it? I mean, you know, always. I don't want to say no, but hopefully that won't happen. We have one of the most powerful ships in the world that's loaded up, and we don't want to have to do anything. What I'd like to see with Iran, I'd like to see them call me.
There you go. That's negotiations, isn't it? It's not war.
No, it isn't. The thing here, people are getting very excited about this aircraft carrier. But I think it's situated off the coast of Oman at the moment. This is not unusual. There are often American aircraft carriers in that region. So I think the media is sort of hyping this up a little bit as something particularly new, and it actually isn't.
I agree. Yeah, it's got 40 to 50 combat aircraft on. That isn't unusual, as Ian said. I think what is interesting is that last week, a routine manoeuvring into theatre of a US warship, pre-scheduled, was rhetorically turned into quite an aggressive move by John Bolton. That's what the difference was.
I agree. I don't think you're right. I'll tell you who's whipping this up. It is the Americans. They're doing quite a lot of theatre around this. So you're right, quite a routine military operation. It's not a massive big deal to have those kind of ships near. They're whipping that up. Then you have Pompeo doing this very dramatic, theatrical dash to Baghdad to dramatise the sort of seriousness of the situation. Now a dash to sort of meet the Brits, and he's kind of not quite accurately saying,
And
I've got
the
full...
Russians.
And the Russians. But, you know, he's basically out there saying that he's got the full support of the Brits, and the Brits have not contradicted him. Yeah, you almost get that there is this kind of theatrical ramping it up. It's to goad Iran into doing the thing.
I think it's classic good...
But just hang on, just let me finish. What they want Iran to do is to be the bad guy again. They are absolutely happy
Remember,
with Iran saying,
did actually
look,
say
60...
you have 60 days. They were the ones that started this latest round.
On the other hand, the Iranians would say...
America pulled out of the nuclear deal. Iran didn't actually do... We might not like Iran, but they haven't done anything wrong.
And the weapons inspectors, the International Atomic Energy Agency, you know, Western-funded organisation, have said in terms that Iran did not break this deal. That's just the truth.
And remember,
of it
those pictures of Trump talking tough do play well with his base. They love seeing him.
Really
Fred, are the signals different? Are we misinterpreting the signals?
President Trump, I think one of the things that that could be an issue here is you have President Trump saying he wants to talk to the Iranians, they should give him a phone call. That's certainly kind of a joke here in Iran. I've actually heard that today from a couple of people. They said, look, we really don't have his number. They also said a lot of them would rather call Melania Trump than actually call Donald Trump. But I think one of the big issues with all of this is essentially you have this maximum pressure campaign by the U.S. government. They are stopping other countries from buying Iranian oil, despite the fact that the Iranians have not breached the nuclear agreement. They're obviously also stopping businesses from doing business here in Iran as well. They're stopping the Iranians from selling some of the low-enriched uranium that they have, which is one of the reasons why the Iranians said they're not going to stick to those portions of the nuclear agreement anymore, because then all of a sudden they would exceed their levels really quickly. It's simply something that they said that they have to do. One of the things that, from all I can see, has never worked with the Iranians is coercion. If you start with ultimatums with the Iranians, that's not something that is going to necessarily work. Anybody who's ever tried to force Iranians to do anything, that is something that they are very, very allergic to. And I think that's also one of the reasons why, if there was ever an armed conflict, God forbid, between the Iranians and the Americans, you would probably see popular support here in Iran for the Iranian government then all of a sudden, because the Iranians don't like to be forced into anything. They're known for being very stubborn people. They're known for being folks who are very happy to go into negotiations, but certainly won't be coerced into doing anything. And I'm not sure whether the government in the United States really understands that. I know that was certainly one of the issues also in the nuclear negotiations in 2015 between John Kerry and Javad Zarif, where they butted heads several times. But that's certainly something that is also to be factored in, is that the Iranians are a very proud nation. They're a nation that certainly are willing to go into negotiations, but coercion is something that really over the years has never worked with the Iranians.
Which brings us on to the British Foreign Secretary's view, which is conflict could happen unintentionally.
We are very worried about the risk of a conflict happening by accident, with an escalation that is unintended really on either side, but ends with some kind of conflict. And so we'll be sharing those concerns with my European counterparts, with Mike Pompeo. And I think what we need is a period of calm to make sure that everyone understands what the other side is thinking. And most of all, we need to make sure that we don't end up putting Iran back on the path to renuclearization.
I think he's absolutely right in what he says there, because wars often break out through the laws of unintended consequences. However, let's not run away with the idea that it's the Americans that are coercing or putting artificial deadlines on Iran. Iran is the one that put this ultimatum to the EU. So we should bear that in mind in this whole discussion.
But they didn't start it. Remember, who pulled out... Look,
no, but why did they issue this ultimatum now?
OK, because they're being goaded. Look, the Iran...
Because the economy's tanking.
The Iran nuclear
Well, they issued...
deal...
can I just jump in there? They issued... There's
a delay.
They issued the ultimatum, a lot of people say, because, first of all, obviously, they're unhappy with the fact that the Europeans haven't come around to helping them pick up some of the losses they have to the nuclear agreement. But then they were also they're allowed to produce low enriched uranium and stockpile some of it. But because they can't sell it anymore, because the U.S. stopped giving waivers to companies and to countries, they're exceeding the limits that they're allowed to stockpile very quickly. And so essentially what Hassan Rouhani and Jawad Zarif said after they said they weren't going to stick to some of these provisions anymore, they said they were still doing that within the framework of the nuclear agreement, and then obviously giving that deadline as well, because they're in a very difficult situation. So yeah, it is the Europeans have obviously said they don't want these deadlines, but the Iranians also obviously would like to see some of the economic benefits of the nuclear agreement, and they want the Europeans to put them in place.
That's characteristically perceptive from Fred. What we're seeing is Trump trying to find a middle ground, I think. This is classic good cop, bad cop. That's because, you know, he knows that if there's an escalation, it won't appeal to his base, as Ian said. And he also knows that oil's at $70 a barrel, and this isn't doing anything good to make gas prices on American forecourts cheaper when people load up their trucks with fuel.
But ultimately, do you know what? The big lesson that America should learn is just stop meddling in other countries' affairs. Honestly, all they're going to do is make things worse. And they're so hypocritical as well. Look, I am no fan of the Iranian regime, but they are branding this as a lawless state. They are best friends with Saudi Arabia, which killed an American journalist recently, which has just beheaded a whole group of miners. You know, it's such hypocrisy. And I'll tell you something, if they stumble into a conflict with Iran, I don't think they will have a huge amount of support from people.
Anna says on Facebook, all this is for the benefit of Israel and Saudi Arabia. Callista says the USA should go home and take care of its own.
Absolutely.
And Meryl says this is rocket man diplomacy, goading and bluster weaponised. Thank you to Fred. Thank you for watching. We'll be back tomorrow.